Welcome to Sound and Vision, conversations with contemporary artists and musicians about the creative process. Here's the host of Sound and Vision, Brian Alfred.
Sound and Vision is proudly sponsored by Golden Artist Colors, manufactured in upstate New York. Golden makes the best acrylics, Williamsburg oils, and core watercolors, along with mediums, textured gels, and so much more. Look, it's not a secret. If you make art, you know Golden. If you haven't used it, pick some up. You'll be hooked. You can find their materials in your local art store or online at goldenpaints.com. Gregory Crewdson is a photographer who was born in Brooklyn, New York. He's a graduate of SUNY Purchase and the Yale University School of Art, where he is now the Director of Graduate Studies in Photography. He lives and works in New York and Massachusetts. In a career spanning more than 3 decades, he's produced a succession of widely acclaimed bodies of work, from Natural Wonder between 1992 and 97, to Cathedral of the Pines between 2013 and 14, Beneath the Roses from 2003 to 2008, a series of pictures that took nearly 10 years to complete, and which employed a crew of more than 100 people. It was the subject of a 2012 feature documentary, Gregory Crewdson, Brief Encounters by Ben Shapiro. The 2018-19 series, An Eclipse of Moths, is set amid down-at-heel post-industrial locations, including an abandoned factory and a disused taxi depot. They serve as backdrops for Crewdson's enigmatic dramas of decay and potential rebirth. A survey of Gregory's work of the previous 20 years toured European museums from 2005 to 2008. The exhibition, In a Lonely Place, traveled to galleries and museums across Europe, Scandinavia, Australia, and New Zealand from 2011 to 2013, and a major monograph was published by Rizzoli in 2013. Gregory's awards include the Skowhegan Medal for Photography, a National Endowment for the Arts Visual Artist Fellowship, and an Aaron Siskin Foundation Fellowship. He's represented by Gagosian Gallery worldwide and by White Cube Gallery in London. I spoke to Gregory about growing up in Park Slope, his days playing in the Speedies, the challenges of being a photographer in these days of image saturation, his intense process, and much more. Here's our conversation. If you've listened, there's no official start to these ever. We just roll on. So, but you are a great candidate for this because you definitely, the band thing, playing music, moving into art, it's all there. I guess you should have been the first episode, really.
I know, it's my regret that in life, but here we are.
We made it happen. So you grew up in Park Slope, right?
I did. I grew up
New Yorker.
I grew up in Park Slope and in a brownstone near Prospect Park, and my father was a psychoanalyst.
Well, that sounds like a relaxing childhood.
He had his office in the basement of our home.
Oh, wow.
And I think when I look back at it retrospectively, that was really significant in terms of, I think, my artistic development. I think my brother and my sister too, but we all had distinct memories of when patients came up the street, we knew not to acknowledge them in any way. And my father had sessions in the basement that was, we were told to be very quiet. And I think one of my earliest memories was attempting to listen to the sessions as a young child, trying to project an image of what I thought I heard.
Yeah. Was it the seriousness of it that intrigued you, or made it kind of you wanted to, figure out what was going on in there?
I think it's just the very nature of having secrets and something forbidden separate from you. That was very powerful. And if I think back at it, that's one of my defining aesthetic memories. It's or awakenings. It's that idea of like trying to project a story onto something that is slightly removed from you.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, if he would have said like, yeah, I got a buddy coming over, we're going to chat downstairs, you probably wouldn't have even wanted to listen.
No, there's something about the formal interplay and the dynamic, I think, between domestic life and something that's like withheld and, as I said, forbidden or secret. And I think that's a defining tension in all my work.
Yeah. So you had the dynamic between that and then, growing up in the city. And my sort of, probably incorrect observation of people that I know who grew up in New York City is that they're always a little bit off. Super smart, really perceptive. And I say this with having a son who's growing up in the city, and he follows in line of very perceptive and able to seemingly filter through an onslaught of stimulus, and but always just a little different.
Yeah, I would include myself in that category. I think,
It's not a bad thing. It just means you if you think about it, growing up in that environment of so much stuff going on, you have to be able to filter it,
I mean, I had a definitely interest in development, let's say adolescence, and that I became very sort of involved in the music scene of going to see bands at CBGB's in Max's, Kansas City, and started a band with my close friends from Brooklyn Friends called the Speedies.
Yeah.
And we were playing out, at various clubs, from the time we were 14, 15 years old. So I look back at it now I have children around that age, and I can't even imagine.
That's an accelerated path of social awareness.
Yeah. And so defining in so many ways. The bands that I saw during that period, I saw the Ramones when I was 13 years old.
Yeah.
And that definitely changed my life, so dramatically. And then, of course, Television and Blondie and Talking Heads and all those it was an amazing period.
Yeah. I mean, a fertile, sort of environment for music and art, and where they collided,
Yeah. And we were a teenage band that our fan base were the various schools around New York. So it became a kind of this school event.
Yeah.
See our shows and at Max's, Kansas City and stuff. It was pretty amazing.
Yeah, just hearing the roster of those bands, that environment, it's kind of, I get a little jealous. I mean, I did that, I was in a high school band in Pittsburgh, and we had a handful of good bands, some indie rock bands, but it wasn't, we weren't playing with that roster.
Well, it's definitely a bygone time,
Yeah.
And our underground hit was a song called Let Me Take Your Photo. So it's all connects. And
yeah, totally. Yeah, that was wasn't that used in a commercial or something?
It was. And by the way, that's photo with a F.
F-O-T-O? Nice. Well, how do you feel about, I feel generationally, I'm younger than you, I think, but I mean, I feel in my lifespan, the change in technology and the change in the way that information and music and art and images, it's such a huge shift, you know what I mean? And thinking about that kind of when I was growing up, being in a band was such a great way to sort of meet people, and you put up flyers, and there was this connected, it's like skateboarding, I skateboarded, and there was a culture of a visual side of it that connected really seamlessly. And then you would see like bands like the Beastie Boys who kind of like put it all together, and it just made sense, and it was like this connective tissue. And now I think maybe the internet has kind of usurped that, but it's so different in a way. And I always wonder like how, I imagine growing up in New York City at that time, there was such a buzz around the event and that kind of culture that is around a scene. I don't think scenes really happen anymore. I think it's a different sort of phenomenon.
I think it's profoundly different, and it's definitely a period that I don't even think anyone could even, so younger people could even comprehend. And I think about that all the time in terms of photography,
right,
and how like Instagram and social media and digital images have so profoundly affected our view of picture making and a kind of democratic appetite for images, which is very different from trying to make a singular photograph that has a presence and authority and exists on a wall,
Yeah, I imagine that's because I feel like as a painter, and I do animation, like those mediums, I think more so with painting, there's a separation there a bit. There's more of a filter of the language of painting, and I think photography must be strange because it is so aligned so closely with the new highway of culture in a way. I think it's really interesting. Whereas maybe I growing up, like it was about like when Fugazi and Unwound came to a basement show or something, and then that was like art in a way. And now it's like a new meme that comes out that everyone's sharing, and it's essentially a photograph or a short video clip, and that becomes some sort of scene in a way. I don't know how to navigate it, but it's interesting to see how it changed,
Well, what's interesting, I think what's powerful about photography in general, and why I'm drawn to the medium is, as I mentioned, it's like democratic in a certain way, and it's the currency of our culture. And we all sort of inherently understand how to read pictures and are confronted with pictures on a daily basis. And that's very different from like other forms of art, which is just by its nature, more hermetic and kind of privatized.
Yeah.
So it's the challenge, in a way, it's the challenge of being a photographer is trying to create a singular vision in that kind of enormous and overwhelming network of images. But if you could figure out a way to do it, or at least attempt, I think it could be meaningful to a much larger audience because of the inherent way we can connect to a photograph, or how a photograph has an alliance with truth,
right,
and actuality.
Yeah, and I think there's one of the interesting differences, I would imagine, between the way photography is so essential to disseminating culture in a way now is like in your photographs you're creating the image, but I think photography, whether it's or just images nowadays when it comes to society, it's so much of almost like sampling or like remixing. There's not a lot of like from scratch anymore. But some of my favorite music, like hip hop, and a lot of that stuff is just made from other stuff. And there's something really interesting about that, I think. But it is a kind of like an old school way to do it, to where, I feel like in your work, it's, I don't want to say celebrated, but it's a very important part of the process that this stuff is all being set up exactly. So, it's the legwork behind it that's informing the vision in a way,
Yeah, well, for me, always, what's most important is a way of seeing the world. That's it's the one thing any artist has, is like their own particular vantage point into a world, seen it in a way that's unlike anyone else's. And so all of the production in my pictures, the use of cinematic lighting and film production, all that is in the service of trying to tell a story that feels particular and unique, that it feels like it's coming from a singular place. So I don't think any of it would be of interest if it didn't have at the core of it a story to tell.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And so much of, in looking at the images, I spent a lot of time when I was young driving across the country and spending time in a lot of different, because the country's big and there's a lot of different areas and types of places and people. And, when I look at your photos, I get a lot of them conjure up, the idea of a place specific to wherever it is, whether it's Middle America or a Midwestern town or whatever, West Virginia, somewhere in the middle. Like, I always get that feeling, even though I don't know where a lot of times these photographs are and who the people are, but there's this sort of Americana feel to it, which I think in the current environment now too, it becomes even more complex and interesting because of this sort of like polarization that's happening in our country between certain places and people, with like the show that you're working on or that you're about to hang now, or is it, I don't know if it's up yet or not, but that new work, is that heavy on your mind when you're doing this,
well,
making
when
these images?
I made the body of works, it's entitled An Eclipse of Moss, and the pictures were actually made in 2018. And I always want to make pictures that feel first and foremost beautiful and mysterious, and I want them to feel like both familiar and slightly outside of time.
Yeah.
And certainly some of the central themes in the work there's definitely themes of alienation and brokenness and some hope of redemption, I would say. And I very deliberately made them all in these kind of anonymous and somewhat like nondescript locations, and I wanted them to have a vast scale with smaller figures inhabiting these places. And of course, like anything else, the pictures have taken on a new meaning in this new context. But they were first and foremost products of me just trying to make pictures that I felt would be meaningful and feel psychologically fraught.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess, whenever you make something that's representational, the climate of whatever's going on in society, it's interesting how it can sort of engage or have slightly different resonance with whatever's happening at the moment, And right now is so sort of, it's such a charged, strange time, that, I remember it was like right before the total shutdown. My wife and son, we hopped in the car and we drove to Times Square, and just seeing it empty. And the few people who were out wearing masks, we just thought to ourselves, if you would have told us like 2 years ago, we would drive in on a Saturday night to Times Square and it would be empty. You know, we never would have believed it, but it's just, but visually it had such an impact on me just seeing it empty. You know, we have these moments in our life where significant events shape the way we see the world, and then after it's over, like September 11th, you know, living through that, after it's over, it's just in there, you know, it becomes part of like the lexicon of visual images in your brain, and I think everything you make talks to that, even if it's not explicit, you know.
Well, I feel like when I'm making pictures, again, not consciously, there are at least three kind of competing forces that kind of exist and create tensions. One is, just by the very nature, pictures have to refer to other pictures, you know, right. And so there's always a relationship between pictures I've made with the tradition and history of the medium. So they're always kind of looking backwards in one way or another, and playing off of that lexicon. And then there's also your competing, also with that is your personal story, you know, your own obsessions and desires and fears and complications, and that is also expressed in the pictures. And then ultimately, the pictures take on relevance to the moment that they exist in. So that's another set of dynamics. And I think that, like, when art is functioning in the highest degree, those three competing forces have a absolute balance, you know, and that's always my hope or my ambition to have.
Chasing that, yeah, right. That the perfect balance between them.
I mean, in a certain way, my pictures are like, I go through an enormous amount of energies to like remove any sign of everyday, like, contemporary life. There are no cell phones in it. There's no all the cars and the houses and the figures. They're all feel somewhat kind of outside of time, and you know, and faded and sort of slightly broken, I think. So there's part of the pictures that feel removed from the moment, and then there's also part of the ambience that feels very much of the moment. So I like that tension, you know. I think it's very hard to make a document of something directly that addresses our time, you know. Although there are great photojournalists who do that, I'm more interested in making images that are sort of less knowable or less fixed or less direct, that they're more ambiguous and more kind of, I guess, poetic in a certain way, you know.
Yeah, like a timeless quality, right? Yeah, I'm always impressed when I see a film that has that aspect to it, because I imagine it's so difficult with moving images and filming in, you know, in the environment to somehow, you know, blur the exactitudes of where, when, how, you know. It must be painstaking to go through that. But and when you were talking about the dialogue that your work has, part of that being the history of images and photography, I would imagine that film, you know, is part of that in a sense, because I mean, there's so much of what you do is kind of feels cinematic, and it feels, you know, like it could be a still from something that's, I mean, anytime you freeze an image, it you know, and it implies a before and after. And that's what I love about painting, is that you can sort of put the viewer in the space of, like, you know, something either just happened or is about to happen, and there can be a real tension with that. And that's an advantage in a way, because in film it just runs its course and then it's over, you know.
Yeah, I feel like photography is very different from other narrative forms, particularly film or literature. Photography is very limited in terms of any capacity to say anything at all. As you said, it's a frozen moment that will never reveal its story in a kind of literal way. And I think that's part of why I'm drawn to photography, because of that very nature, the open-ended nature of all pictures, And I am very much interested in that moment that seems to exist between something before and something after. At the same time, I love movies and an enormous fan of movies, maybe even more than art in a certain way. And, so clearly my pictures have been shaped by the way movies look. So I love, and one of the things I miss profoundly now is going to a movie theater and being part of that collective dream of seeing light projected on a screen, which is just such a beautiful kind of dreamlike state.
Yeah. Remember movies?
Yeah, sort of, Yeah.
Have you gone to a drive-in?
I have.
I love drive-ins. I grew up on them. I haven't gone to one since this all happened, but I mean, if I'm going to see a movie, I would love to go to a drive-in. We
went to a screening locally with our children of Ferris Bueller's Day Off. That was interesting.
Oh my God. I don't know how you feel about that movie, but that movie was so tattooed in my brain. I mean, it's one of those coming of age movies, It
was amazing to see how the children couldn't connect to it. They couldn't understand the references.
Oh, really? It was lost on...
It was completely lost on them, Do you know Hiroshi Sugimoto's photographs of
course, yeah.
Of those? I love those photographs he made of both in movie theaters and also in drive-ins of the whole duration of the film.
Yeah.
In black and white. And
those are beautiful. I saw those. I saw a show of his. I want to say it was in DC, maybe. I can't remember where it was, but yeah, it was just. They're beautiful.
They're beautiful meditations on the nature of time and the landscape and the photographic image, and really, I think, powerful pictures.
Yeah, there's a few kind of artists who have shows like that, or a body of work or something like that really turns things on its head. And when I saw Christian Marclay's piece, I forget what it was, The Clock. Yeah, I mean, things like that, just like, you're like, wow.
That's a masterpiece.
Yeah. Anytime you could take film and then tweak it, or, I like Koyaanisqatsi for me, like as tedious as that can be, or, sometimes I'll show it to students and the look on their face of sheer, pain. It's almost like they're in pain watching. But I feel like when I first saw that movie, I was just like, wow, and then I didn't really know Philip Glass or Steve Reich or any of that music at that time. And it was just so haunting. And I don't know, it had there were movies like Weekend, like the scene in Weekend with the car crash. Like there's certain film, and I'm by no means like a great, I don't have great knowledge of film, but I've seen a lot of stuff that, just leaves this mark on your brain of like how you can make work or think about things differently with images, and that The Clock one was one of those.
I agree.
Well, when you were making music and collaborating, and you're working on writing songs and playing out, that kind of like collaborative effort to be creative, and then the sort of the energy of performing live, I imagine outside of the area of collaboration is a totally different pace than the way that you are being creative in your own work. Do you sort of align more with one or the other? Or was it, I mean, for me, it was kind of like I had played music so long with people and being in bands, and it got to a point to where I just didn't want to be in a van anymore, driving across the country, playing dive, playing like little venues and waiting for practice, like waiting for other people. And there was something almost liberating about just, okay, me in the studio. Did you have what's the dynamic between the way you work?
My experience in being a band was fairly short-lived, but it was definitely filled with like teenage angst and desire. It was like a period of time that I think was very much about being a certain age and having a certain experience. It's unforgettable to me, and I don't think anything could really replace those kinds of direct experiences with an audience, or making photographs, which I started doing at a fairly sort of later. I mean, actually around the same time the band broke up, I started to fall in love with the medium of photography. And I think part of why I responded to it was it isn't sort of by nature, it's there's an interesting kind of voyeuristic aspect to it, and there's also a stillness that I really responded to. I had difficulty academically, sort of dyslexic, and the nature of like test taking and writing papers and even reading was like somewhat painful for me. And I went to SUNY Purchase, and I thought I'd follow in the line of my father and try to be a psychiatrist, but I just couldn't sort of academically. It was very almost painful for me, and I wound up taking a photo class just by almost. Just out of curiosity, and immediately from moment one when I made my first picture, I immediately knew I could read a photograph in a way that I couldn't absorb other things. Just the frozen and mute nature of it, and just the fact that I think I realize now, I think in terms of still images, and so it became immediately apparent to me that this is something I understood and loved. But even then, like very early on, I was really intrigued with the intersection between still photographs and the moving image. I studied with a lot of great faculty there, but like this guy, Tom Gunning, who was a cinematic professor. Actually, Nola Dargis, who now is the lead film critic for the New York Times, she was in my class, and we both studied him, and I think we were both like separately influenced by him in different ways. But even then, like I was taking classes on Hitchcock and the 1950s melodrama and horror films, and these are things that are defining to me now,
Yeah, I think Rear Window is my favorite movie of all time.
Yeah.
And I don't know how it is defining in my making art life, but I know it is. Like, I know it's just in there or something,
Well, what's great for me about that film, I love all of Hitchcock's films, but that one particularly because it's really about the uncomfortable relationship between being a photographer and being both voyeuristic and impotent at the same time. That like just so how that set sort of beautifully describes that like fascination with peering into other people's lives, but also the inability to like act, to be active. And I don't know, I think all photographers in a certain way are drawn to the medium by a similar kind of detachment or remove. And I think that's why this period is so interesting, because of there is a certain kind of social distancing built into the sort of the whole process of making pictures. Something there's a certain element in my work, I think always, of describe it as like being there but not there. You're sort of at a slight removed, peering in on a world. And when my pictures, I think at their best, there's a kind of coming together of intimacy and detachment that is an interesting dynamic.
Yeah, it's really interesting too to think that, the person who's photographing that scene, it's like they're removed from it in a way. They're seeing it through a filter, they're experiencing it through the lens, through something else. But the people who sometimes are at, like let's say it's a music venue event and there's a photographer taking pictures of the crowd and the band or whatever, those people can be anonymous, or like, the event passes, but the photographer has that image that becomes their ticket to the event, but they're seeing it through that lens. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, I always have that, I feel like I'm a bad photographer in a way, because I never want to take photos, because I'll get that feeling of like, I want to be just living it and not stepping outside and being like, okay, hold on, let's take a photograph of this. You know what I mean? But I feel like it's so important.
Because I am, by nature, I'm sort of uncomfortable with cameras. And even when we're shooting, like, I frame the scene, but like I actually have a cameraman sort of making the actual exposures. And because I want to have a direct relationship to what I see in front of me, like, to me, what's most interesting is that thing, that world that we created, that only comes to life, for fractions of a second, when everything, the short period where it feels like there's something vital there. And so I don't tend to take many pictures outside of being an artist. Like, I actually don't even own like a camera. I mean, on occasion I'll use, like I'll make some cell phone pictures of my kids or something. But to me, I have a sort of weird, sort of disconnected relationship to the actual medium.
Right. But it's only because photography is so ingrained into our day to day and everyone can do it. It's like painters are never expected to say, well, I don't normally paint scenes from my daily life, whereas, hundreds of years ago, plein air painting was your camera. You know what I mean?
Right,
so
right.
Like it was a part of that process. But with photography, it's just everyone has access to that medium. And it's so fast now, like everything's sped up, that, there's a closer relationship between the two, I think. But you're actually, you're making the painting with the photograph in a sense. Like you're creating that event in a way, that image, as opposed to just capturing an image.
Well, as I sort of suggested before, it's like, just by this very nature, and it's even like Instagram is very much about just the moment, and it's meant to be disposable. Like pictures have a very short life on in the virtual space. And I think that all photographers have to think about that and their relationship to it, and acknowledge that, like, that's how 99.9% of images work now, as like instantaneous and disposable, and what's the real challenge is to make pictures that, as I sort of said before, feel lasting and permanent and physical, like a physical thing that exists on a wall that's an object rather than a mirage.
Right. Well, the moment you put it in a gallery and it's framed and it's large scale, immediately separates it out from that, 2-inch by 2-inch square sort of thing. So it completely changes it. But do you feel like, say, as opposed to 20 years ago, when you had a show and people came and saw that work and there was the discussion about that work, do you feel like it's changed a lot, sort of the way people digest the work and see the photographic image now as opposed to, say, 20 years ago?
Yeah, well, I would say that, and certainly in this circumstance, the great degree of people who will see the images will not see them sort of in a one-to-one space, they'll see it either on their phones or on their computer screens. And I'm not against that at all. I think that that you have to kind of accept that's sort of the distribution center, way of sort of carrying this information. But there, one hopes that, like, still within all of that, the thing on the wall still has a very particular meaning in a particular place at a particular time.
Yeah. Well, I think given the fact that people can't even get to a lot of museums or see things in person these days, really heightens that sort of, that dynamic and the importance of seeing something in flesh and how different it is, than the quote-unquote online show or whatever. I think it's this kind of pandemic and has kind of forced people into, or it's pushed this kind of virtual experience. It's put the pedal to the metal on that, where it was kind of inching along towards it. And like in thinking of that idea in relation to Rear Window, in relation to just photography in general, of like creating worlds and images, it really goes back, like I can't help but think of like Plato's Cave and this idea of, that everything that we're seeing is kind of this sort of realized imagination in a way. It's our brain is formulating the world out of these images, and it's also subject to change and in the virtual aspect of things. I don't know, that really throws things for a loop. Have you done any kind of, or how do you feel about the whole virtual reality, augmented reality, that end of the spectrum of how images are migrating into the digital world?
I haven't had much direct experience with virtual reality, except the virtual reality that's become my life, that we all experience on a daily basis, right. That like the weird paradox of like how we're all isolated yet all connected at the same time. It's a very uneasy feeling that I think we all experience. And even now when we're like in contact with actual people in actual places, it just increases the discomfort because we're so used to being in our Plato's caves.
Yeah. Yeah, the idea of, an opening where it's, the crowded, humid opening, like even in the winter, if you have an opening and there's like a ton of people in there and it gets clammy, it's like a sauna. The idea of that happening, you can't imagine it at this point.
Or what about concerts or movie theaters? Or, these are things we all have taken for granted and are important kind of ritualistically. And it's going to be very interesting to see like how these things will come back and in what form, because they do serve a purpose, a bonding purpose and in humanity and in terms of community and gatherings of things,
Yeah, I worry though that the longer it goes, the less people are going to, the more people will get comfortable being isolated, because we were kind of inching that way anyways with our, cyborg, phones that become a computer that we engage with more. Like, how many times have you gone out and see people on at a dinner and they're both on their phones, not even talking to each other?
That used to be unusual. It's not anymore.
Right. You remember when you would look at it and you'd be like, oh my God, they're just on their phone. Now you're like, yep, there they go. And like when you go see shows, I was just talking to a musician about, I went to Art Basel, Miami, and my brother and I went out late night to see a show, and everyone had this guy was like doing a DJ set, and he was there was no stage or anything. He was just in the middle of this like bar, and everyone crowded around him, and every single person had the phone up taking video. So it looked almost like fireflies, and like you couldn't see him. And it was so bizarre. Like, and I grew up, I mean, not to sound old, but I grew up in like indie gigs in basements where you'd be crammed in there and everyone's just, trying to get as close to the band as possible and moving around. And there was no thought of like taking photos or whatever. There would always be the one guy at all the shows who had like a nice camera who would take these great photographs, and they would show up on like, in a zine like 2 months later or something. And now it's like everyone's got the phones up. You can't even see what's happening. And, it's almost like we were inching towards that. And now it's just, I don't know, people are going to become more and more comfortable being uncomfortable around people. I don't know if you saw that photograph. I think it was in the UK. It was an outdoor festival. And they made these little metal pods that people would go in that are 6 feet apart. So it's almost like a drive-in, but it's just like these little risers that are like a little balcony thing for each group of people. And they were just, out. And then, someone posted this image of it. And then I was reading some of the comments and people were like, yeah, that doesn't sound so bad. Like, I kind of hate going to shows and getting crushed up front. And this, we could sit down and just experience it, quietly. And which is like the opposite of what going to a concert really is about. But I don't know, maybe we're gonna, right? Maybe we're gonna evolve into that being our experience of things.
Well, we'll never go back to what it was. It'll be something other than it is now, and something other than it was.
Yeah, I guess that's evolution or something. Remember when you used to go to a movie theater and there would just be rows of seats? I went to a movie out with the in-laws, and like you reserve your seats and they're like these giant recliners, and you have like you are social distance. This is before the pandemic, you know what I mean? And it's kind of like, it's not like the way you went to see a movie, and now it's just it's like your living room basically. Exactly.
Or your living rooms become the movie theater too.
Right. But then again, I fall victim, because when I do that, I'm like, well, this is kind of nice. I don't want to be, have like the 10-year-old kid behind me kicking my chair the whole movie. Just be irritated the whole time, But then like everyone in your aisle's on their phone and you see the glow of the phone while they're watching the movie. So, you can't win. So are you still, I'm going to guess yes, but are you still an avid music fan?
Oh, yeah.
Are you diverse in it, or what's your...
Well, I love all music, and I, constantly listen, listening to various podcasts, and Jeff Tweedy wrote the introduction to this book, and I really admire him and Wilco. I'm a very big fan, and I do feel like there's this really nice relationship between their music and my photographs, a similar kind of sense of beauty and sadness,
Yeah.
and so that was great to get to know him. And
That's really cool. When did you first meet him?
well, I've been a huge Wilco fan for a long time, and they do these. I'm sure you know solid sound shows at Mass Mocha, and I think I got to know him through that, and we've been wanting to do something for some time. So this is a really great occasion. He wrote a really beautiful, very short and powerful intro to this book.
Don't you love it when like a musician writes something about art? It's just immediately, to me, it becomes more interesting than like an art critic or something. No offense, guys, but there's something really cool about the way musicians respond to images.
Well, particularly like when, Wilco has been like kind of a soundtrack to me for so long, and so it was great to actually have that manifest. But I still listen to music constantly, and very interested in, read Pitchfork and all the various, I'm always trying to keep engaged.
Yeah. I had thought maybe you crossed paths with him because I remember in New Haven in 1999, I want to say, when I was a student. So I was in a band when I was there, and we played Rudy's, and we had a side project. It was a Latin jazz band, but it was a bunch of white kids. And we played Rudy's, and I think it was Jeff. It was someone from Wilco, but I believe it was Jeff who showed up at our show, which was kind of funny to be playing, Rudy's, and there's like 1 million people jammed in there, and then someone reaches over and said, "Hey, the guy from Wilco's here watching the show." And I had guessed they played maybe Toads or something, and then they came over after, which was pretty cool.
I've been to both places, Toads and Rudy's, and I saw some great shows there over the years, actually.
Yeah, Rudy's was a fun place to play,
Yeah, I saw like Dump Truck and other interesting bands from that period.
Yeah, and that was a good photo period. I mean, we had a lot of friends who were in the photo department, and there was a lot of energy going on then.
Yeah, that's great.
And a lot of great people came out of that, who I don't know what it was, but a lot of them, a lot of the people I knew in photo were really interested and ended up like doing a lot of traveling across the country and taking photos, out in the wild, so to speak.
Well, photographers are by nature are travelers. I mean, I don't include myself in that because I'm pretty much a homebody, but I think there's something about the process of making pictures which is very connected to sort of a certain kind of rootlessness.
Yeah, and seeing like seeing something new is nice, new landscapes and new places. I mean, when I first started, I grew up pretty poor and I never traveled anywhere, I didn't start traveling until playing music around the country, but then also when I started showing artwork and traveling to different countries to have shows and stuff. And it really informed my work and my eye, and just seeing new places, it becomes addictive, like I would love to just travel everywhere and check places out, and the different landscapes and the light. It's amazing.
Unfortunately, that's not possible at the moment.
No, I know. I'm hoping that can you tell it's been a while since I've traveled and I'm getting the itch? I feel that, I usually travel to Japan at least once a year, and I miss it,
Yeah, I mean, I commute back and forth to Brooklyn and New Haven, but essentially during the pandemic, I've been here. As I mentioned to you earlier, I live in Great Barrington, which is in the Berkshires, and I live in a church, a Methodist church from 1890, and my studio is right next door, and it's a former firehouse. So I have my own little sort of community here, you know.
Yeah, that's great.
How long have you been there?
About 10 years.
Nice.
And I moved from Brooklyn and been here pretty permanently. And during ordinary times, there's a lot of commuting that I have to do, but now I'm basically here.
You're Zoom commuting.
Yes. Yeah.
So do you, as someone who grew up in the city, I mean, do you find, as I get older, the idea of moving outside the city is more and more tempting?
I love living here, and I'm also a religious open water swimmer. I swim every day. It's very part of my routine, and particularly during the summer months. So I'm sort of very connected to the landscape in various ways. And of course, I do most of my, or all of my photography in this area as well. So it makes a lot of sense for me to be here.
Oh, that's good. So you're where you're working, basically. And whenever you, like, let's say you have an idea for an image, I mean, front to back, is that a long-term planning thing? Or do you have collaborators in the area? Or do you have to set things up from outside? How complex is that process?
It takes, a body of work really does from beginning to end take literally years.
Yeah.
It begins with me just location scouting. And that could take months of just like finding the locations of what I feel can accommodate one of my pictures. You know, I'm looking for something that feels ordinary and nondescript, but also feels like it can also have a certain kind of formal beauty. And then through that process, images occur to me. And then I work with my partner, Julianne, who we write the descriptions. She writes them. For each picture, there's a description. And then we get closer to the actual production. And by that time, we have then a line producer and my longtime director of photography, Rick Sands, and his whole team. And so it becomes this, very sort of, the productions usually last like 6-7 weeks. And we have a crew of about 50 people altogether, including location scouts and scenics and lighting crew and all that. And so then we shoot for like 6 weeks. It's like it's like a short film, or not a short film, like an independent film. And then it takes about a year to like work in post-production, and we do that all here, painstakingly. Work with my printer who comes up and lives here. And we, bit by bit, composite the pictures and spend enormous amount of time just like trying to recreate the moment that the pictures, what it felt like to make the picture. So altogether, it's about a 2 or 3 year process, beginning to end. The shortest period of time is the time where we're actually making the pictures, unfortunately.
Right. Yeah, it seems dissimilar to, shooting a movie front to back.
Yeah. It's very similar arc of like conception, pre-production, production, and post-production, and then finally at the very end of it, having the kind of premiere of the work, and then you start the process again.
Yeah, but you don't have DreamWorks, I don't think, producing the thing. So, I mean, is that all you have to do all that? I guess maybe you have, it's like a system of working all that stuff out. It just seems like the bureaucracy of all that stuff of just lining it up and would take forever.
It's very challenging, and fortunately I have galleries that help support the venture, and but it is like never easy, and you also have to be incredibly inventive in terms of ways to like cut costs and like depend on the kindness of others, but there are ways to do it, and one of the advantages of working over and over again in a same sort of area is that you become a kind of known figure, and that the city, in this case, all the pictures were made in Pittsfield, they're become much more willing to help you. Like, we actually asked a lot from them in this body of work where we wanted, we needed to change light bulbs and street lamps and try to have not them to mow or pave. So there were a lot of things that, they helped us with. And, but that's all in the effort of like, as I said earlier, of like trying to create a kind of vision of the world.
Right. Yeah. Well, you must like it to some extent, that process, or you probably wouldn't do it that way. You know what I mean?
Well, I love it, in fact, but also it's the only way I know how to make pictures. It's like the way I figured it out, It's like,
right.
And I guess if I didn't have to go through all of this struggle and circumstance, I wouldn't. But I haven't figured out a way how not to. I mean, I do really love production, and I love the kind of just the kind of hectic quality of it, and like, things are going wrong and we're losing the light and there are weather problems and some neighbors aren't, being cooperative, or we have like a technical issue and, this lift doesn't work, or this fog machine's down, or whatever, these things, But in the end, like, if the picture works, all of that recedes, and there is this moment of grace where, it all makes sense, and that makes it all worth it to me.
Yeah, and I as a bystander, the power of those pictures, it feels like that's what's, coming from that, the power of that moment. And like, you may not know, I feel like I feel like people who put that stuff into what they do, even if you don't know what that is, it comes off. And I mean, maybe that's kind of an idealistic viewpoint, but I feel like, like the people who really feel the work, or really put that work into it, or are dedicated to it, it comes off, and you see that in the work, I think. And your photos have that resonance. They have that, that it feels like an inner energy of all the what may look like the forces align, and this moment just happens to happen almost effortlessly, but that there's a lot behind that there's a real power to that, and it's got like an energy. I remember that picture of Allison in the flower, or like the dirt inside. I mean, that is such a strong image, and it has like it seems transcendent, which in photography, I feel like it's not an easy thing to do, you know?
Well, I think that, like, as I said, at the core of it, it's just like the vision is the most important thing, you know, the story that you want to tell and will into existence in one way or another, you know.
Yeah. It's probably an annoying question, but someone's going to kick me if I don't ask it, that, you know, I mean, are you tempted to do movies, like full scale on movies? I mean, it feels like, you know, it would be a language of image making that you would probably be able to adapt to. I mean, maybe you have made movies, but I mean...
Well, there has been, you know, always the temptation, and there is a project that we have been working on for some time. And ultimately, if it, the challenge will be, if it's possible, is to extend this world, you know, and the kind of open-endedness and the storytelling all together to. If it's possible to do it in a movie form, then, you know, if everything felt right, I would, you know, like to try it.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, I'm very happy doing what I'm doing, which is sort of continuing to make the still photograph feel like powerful and important and mean something in this, you know, in this time.
Yeah, definitely. It's funny because when I first started showing work and was making paintings, I was really celebrating the tension of the feeling that something's about to happen, but you're not actually seeing it happen most of the time. And when I started doing animations, you would think, oh, you can make the event happen. And I found myself trying to do that even in movement, of like the lead up to what could happen, or the quiet moments, almost subverting what usually happens in animation as like this narrative front to back story or whatever. And it would be interesting if that, like, you know, as far as video or film, if you ever did that, if it turned into that, of trying just to stretch out those moments and not have it turn into that definitive narrative.
Yeah, well, that would be going against the current of most everything we experience now, you know.
Right. Exactly. But I feel like there's some filmmakers who play with that idea in history. One of my favorite movies is Playtime, and I feel like that movie, it just feels like this weird, just moments, you know. It's like leading up to nothing in a way, or so. It's just, you know, anti-narrative in a sense, even though there's a narrative.
To me, the most important thing is, like, what I always look for, whether it's like a movie or a novel or a photograph or a painting, an animation, is a convincing world, you know, that feels deliberate and feels unmistakable. You know, it's almost irrelevant what the genre or the medium is. I mean, that's a great achievement, like to create a world that feels like clearly seen and in a certain way real, you know.
Yeah.
Like that's I think if my work in any, you know, I think is misunderstood in certain ways, is that it's like this completely staged thing. I'm not really looking to use production in that way. What I really wanted is all to disappear and to create a world that feels convincing and real and lived in, and I want the viewer to sort of feel like they could enter into that world and be part of it.
Yeah, No, I think that comes across. People just like to talk about that, the other like what goes behind it. You know what I mean? It's kind of like the people go to see a electronic musician play, and like I just like to hear the music. There's a lot of people who come up and be like, well, what software are you using, or what do you? They sort of tech out to it, you know what I mean, and be like, well, how are you making that noise? And now people are Twitch streaming how they do things, so people get really into the process of stuff,
Oh, absolutely, and I understand that completely, and I'm, completely understand that photography is a technological medium, and that like my pictures are very dependent on large-scale production and all that. But at the core of it, I want it, I do want it to disappear, although I obviously love discussing it and, and want people to know in a certain way of how the process was, how the picture was made. But it's a very separate experience from standing in front of it and just absorbing it.
I was going to say that is really the power of the gallery, the quiet gallery, where you walk in and you just have those images. It's weird. It's funny because the more away from that environment I am, and I've seen a couple shows, maybe like 2 or 3 shows since they started reopening. You notice just how rare it is to walk into a space that's quiet, and there's only 1 or 2 people, and then there's these really, vibrant, even if they're muted, vibrant images sort of like talking to you. That's a very rare experience in our life. I think that's why so many people who don't know about art are freaked out by galleries, because like, what the hell is this? It's just like a weird place with just images on the wall. You know what I mean? But it's a really powerful, introspective, rare thing in our world.
Yes, absolutely, and really fulfills an important need that we all have, and that is to like connect to something outside of ourselves and have that moment of deliberation and clarity.
Yeah.
Well, so when does the show open that you're going to hang?
The show actually opens on September 24th and will run through November, I believe.
Oh, that's a good stretch.
And I think it will be open by appointment primarily.
Yeah.
Although people are going out now, cautiously are going to galleries now. I'm assuming based on people photographing, posting pictures from shows, socially responsibly, checking out art, which is good, It'll
be an interesting, I'm very interested to see how the pictures will exist in this world that we're in.
Yeah, it's like you said. I think you alluded to it's an odd reverberation between that feeling of isolation that should be really, really engaging. I think. Great. Well, how else can people check out your website? It's the best place to see your work.
I actually don't have a website,
or the gallery website, I guess.
Yeah, and there will be a book of these pictures published by Aperture, as I mentioned, with Jeff Tweedy writing the intro, and
yeah,
and we're going to make our best efforts to have the pictures exist out in the world as well.
Yeah, that's great. Sounds cool. I mean, I wish I could see the show.
Where are you, by the way?
I'm in Brooklyn.
Well, the show will open in New York at some point, so it's a question of when.
Cool. Well, it was great talking to you.
I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
It was really amazing, interesting, lots of twists and turns.
Thanks.